everyone. Welcome to the Ashley Barlow Company podcast. I'm Ashley Barlow, your host. If you are a parent, a teacher, or someone who works at a school, or you're a community member, a volunteer, or a staff member at an organization that supports people with special education plans, a coach, a tutor, or even a grandparent, you're in the right place. Sit back with an ice cold glass of lemonade, put on your walking shoes and grab some headphones, roll down the windows and cruise. Ready, set, go. Educate, advocate, collaborate. Welcome back to the Special Education and Advocacy podcast with Ashley Barlow. I am joined today by my friend Solandy Forte. Hi, Solandy.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited for you to share all of your knowledge with my audience.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. This is special. Thank you.
Well, yes, Solandy and I are friends. We actually became friends through Solandy's husband, Jeff Forte, who I met at ISEA, which is a Wrightslaw training. And then I met Solandy just a few months later at the COPAA conference. And was that in Monterey the first time?
Yes, the first time was in Monterey. And then the second time we were in Baltimore.
Yes. And we were scared of COVID. Really scared.
We were very scared. We were a week away or days away from a closure.
Yes. You know, it's funny, Solandy, just really quickly, well, my audience will have to bear through a friendship conversation. I was talking to Pete Wright earlier this week, and I like name drop, boop. And I was saying to him at COPA, it was so funny because we really didn't know, like almost at the beginning of the weekend, we were still almost laughing, like, oh, somebody's coughing, you know. And then by the end of the weekend, riding home on the airplane, I felt so uncomfortable and so scared. And it was just so crazy how it happened. I mean, that was the first weekend of March, right? So it was like, we really didn't know.
You were probably flying back sometime in like March 2nd, 10th or 11th.
Yeah. Okay. So it was probably the second weekend of March. Yeah. Because my kids were in school 2 days and then our schools closed.
Yeah. It's crazy.
It was crazy. So Solandy, we started by just chatting, but why don't you take a second and introduce yourself to my audience?
Sure. So I am a board certified behavior analyst, doctoral level board certified behavior analyst, and I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. By way of background, I started my career as when I was 19 as an instructional assistant, learning about autism for the first time and applied behavior analysis for the first time. In order to progress and learn more about the field and help families who are struggling with children who have been diagnosed with autism or any other developmental disability, I then said, okay, I need to go get my master's. And I thought what made the most sense was to get my master's in social work. So I went back to school. I got my master's in social work. And then after a few years, maybe even a decade, I decided to go back and get my doctorate in applied behavior analysis. I am currently the director of Milestones Family Services at Milestones Behavioral Services in Connecticut. We have 2 private schools that serve children who are either on the autism spectrum or have a related developmental disability. I also, at Milestones Behavioral Services, when we talk about the program that I'm the director of, Milestones Family Services, have a clinic. The clinic sees children between the ages of 12 months and 12 years who have been diagnosed with autism. And we also have a social skills group. We do school consultations. So we're in public schools a ton. We also have a strong parent education program that I'm very passionate about. And we also have a consultation program that is trying to expand its reach and allow access to folks who are not able to easily access high quality ABA services. So that's called ABA Global Access. Yeah, so we sort of we serve people, right, on the spectrum and also with related developmental disabilities in a variety of different aspects, right? We have a private school, but we also have a clinic. So that's funded by insurance. So
That's
yeah,
awesome. And Solandy, that's why I think that your knowledge is so important, because you see things in alternative placements, you see things the way that they work in children's homes, you see things in a clinical therapeutic setting, and that is super valuable to the special education population, as you well know. In fact, Solandy and I have already talked about having her on the podcast again to talk about collaborative services with outside BCBAs that could come in and do evaluations in school
right,
settings. So
right.
stay tuned for that, because I think that there's a lot of value in that as well. But the reason why we have you here today is because I really want to talk about FBAs and BIPs. So functional behavioral assessments, and then the behavior intervention plan that follows. And the reason I want to talk about it kind of in a broad sense, Solandy, is because this is a big topic. This is like a hot topic. This is something that if I speak on behavior, my audience is higher. If I have, a lot of people that are interested in a topic, it's always behavior. They always want to know about behavior. And so I'm so excited to talk to you today about behavior. I think what I'd like to start off with is that FBA. So can you explain just basically what the definition of an FBA is? What's a functional behavioral assessment?
Sure. So a functional behavior assessment is um, an assessment that we do as not only behavior analysts, but school psychologists or psychologists can conduct FBAs. Someone who has background in evaluating behavior, like maybe a special education teacher or a social worker. We are basically looking to understand what is making that behavior of concern tick, right? What is triggering that behavior? What's keeping it alive? Why is it still happening, right? So we're trying to understand the entire environment and what happens before the behavior, what happens after the behavior, who's reinforcing it, who's triggering it. And there's a lot that we have to examine when we're looking at a functional behavior assessment. So when you ask me, what does it mean to do a functional behavior assessment? I typically say, well, it's an assessment that's actually going to help you gather, or your team gather information to identify the functions of behavior. And when we talk about the functions of behavior, we're talking about why behavior is happening. Okay. If you have that information, then you're able to determine what you need to do about it. And
Right.
most importantly, how to prevent it. Because if you can prevent it, you don't have to manage it.
Yeah, that's just it. So when would a parent be interested in an FBA? Like, when oftentimes schools will suggest doing an FBA, but when would it come up onto a parent's radar that an FBA might be appropriate at school?
It's the same reason why it would be probably right come up on an educator's radar. There's a problem, right? There is a behavior that's interfering with learning. It's interfering with the daily functioning of a child and their family, right? It could be in this setting in the home, or it could be at school. It could be in the community. There is a problem. I always say, and I think this is important, Ashley, that a functional behavior assessment is a reactive assessment, meaning you recommend it or you request it when, right, there's a problem, as
Yeah.
a reactive assessment.
It is. And that's really interesting. I've never heard anybody say that before, Solandy, but I agree. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons why people are almost intimidated by FBAs, or they think FBAs are, like unnecessary or overkill or something, because, children have to be evaluated to be in special education. And then they're evaluated all the time by way of progress monitoring and whatnot. But if there's an FBA, it's usually because there's a problem. There has to be a
Right.
problem first
Right.
for that FBA. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And more specifically, like, when I'm going into any setting and a team says to me, oh, we have permission. Yeah, we have the FBA scheduled for some time this year. I'll say, well, why was it requested? Right? There's got to be a reason why it was requested. Oh, we have it as part of our sort of annual thing. We do it just on an annual, so we ask for it, and we'll get it done at some point. I usually say, if there isn't a problem, if you don't suspect that there are new behaviors that are interfering, then there's no need for an FBA.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, right. To the contrary, a lot of people think they don't need them. And to the contrary, some people think they need them or they need to change it.
Yeah.
And you don't need to look at the FBA. If the behaviors are the same, or if you've got them under control with prior interventions and knowledge that you got in a prior assessment, then why come back and look at it again?
Right. I'm going to take it a step further too, Ashley. So let's say a functional behavior assessment was done for a behavior like, I don't know, let's say verbal outbursts, right? The kids just sort of shouting out in class, they're not able to participate. A lot of attention is sort of on them from their peers and from their adults telling them, like, like, let's raise your hand, or let's try to gain somebody's attention, in an appropriate manner. So let's say we did an FBA on verbal outbursts, and we put a behavior intervention plan in place, and everything's fine and everything's working. And they're in third grade after the FBA was done and the behavior support plan was put in place. Everything's great. This year was wonderful. But then they get into fourth grade, and all of a sudden, the same behavior that you had basically ameliorated is now popping up again. Would you do another FBA on that same behavior when you already have it well understood, but a year ago? The answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because the environment changed.
Right.
If the environment changed, then maybe the function changed. Okay.
Right.
So you have to think about those things too. That's why I keep going back to it's a reactive assessment. I want to gain more information about this behavior. And there's a number of reasons. You asked me, why would a parent request it? Right? Because there's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And Solandy, I want to ask you about the functions of behavior. So I have so many parents that bring me IEPs that, and mostly it's in the present levels of performance, or it's in progress reporting, but sometimes it's like in a weird place in the IEP where it'll really talk about a child's performance and say that they do well when they want to, and or basically like if they can behave, then they do well. And I always take anything out. I've said this on the podcast before. I try to revise anything in an IEP that makes behavior look voluntary, because it makes me in the IEP, then it looks like the child can control things. And the whole purpose of looking at behavior is looking at the function of it to figure out the why. Mm-hmm. And so if it's, if I've got a child that's really impulsive, then they can't control the fact that they're hitting somebody. So then we have to look at why they're hitting somebody, right? Is it to get attention? Is it sensory regulation? Whatever. And so I try to explain that to teachers when I, am revising the IEP.
Sure.
But I think the language of the function of behavior is really important in that conversation, even if it's not in an FBA, right? So can you talk a little bit about the functions of behavior?
Sure. So there are 4 functions. One of them is attention. So an individual may be engaging in a behavior to gain attention from others. The second one is tangible items, right? So The individual is engaging in behavior to gain access to something tangible. The third is called automatic reinforcement. So they're doing it, they're engaging in a behavior to gain access to some internal feeling. A lot of kids who have autism engage in stereotypic behavior, right? Because it feels good. They're kind of getting some kind of sensory input.
That regulates them.
And right, right. And then the last one is escape or avoidance. So I'm engaging in behavior to escape a situation that's probably not preferred, or avoid it altogether.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the 4 functions of behavior. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. There are 4 functions of behavior. What's important here, and you had mentioned something, you had said, if you have a kid who's impulsive, you know, they're not necessarily able to control their impulsivity. That's what you said, right? I'm then going to say, well, if we understand why this child is engaging in these behaviors and we understand the function of those behaviors, then we can identify interventions that are function based.
Mm-hmm.
And we can start to teach replacement behaviors, right? Yeah. Right. Yes. If they're engaging in impulsive behaviors, let's teach them how to do something different.
Or proactively support them before the behavior even
occurs,
comes up. So that, if it's a child that's looking for sensory regulation and they might just need a little bit of heavy work first, then it never even comes up because they're regulated for the next 30 or 45 minutes or however long that sensory regulation technique works, right? And that's the beauty of it.
That's the preventative side. That's why you have to look at both, right? There has to
be. I read a book when I was it was parenting. I didn't read it for work. But at the beginning, the doctor that wrote the book says, parents will come to me and they'll say, I've tried it all. And he says, well, that's the problem. You need one strategy. And that has stuck with me as I've navigated behavior with children on my caseload. We just need to figure out the function, and then we need to figure out how to support the function with positive interventions and replacement behaviors and, kind of that litany that we'll get into here in a second. So I love that. Okay, Solandy, that is really great. Can you talk about the elements to an FBA? Because far too often I see an FBA that feels very insufficient and really doesn't tell me much about the functions of a child's behavior. What's in one?
Sure. So I start with the student profile or the child's profile. That is going to help me then pick the tools and the instruments that I'm going to use to gain that information while doing the functional behavior assessment. So it's not an FBA is not sort of cookie cutter, right? It's not a formula. It's not, in order for it to be an FBA, it has to have these specific tools. In order to be a comprehensive FBA, yes, you need to make sure that you have indirect methods of assessment and direct methods of assessment. Mm-hmm. When I start to talk about indirect methods of assessment, I'm talking about things like interviewing the family to learn a little bit more about their child, what the behaviors are of concern, and the environments that this behavior is occurring most often in, or with who, right? Understanding what the triggers are. Once I start to interview, then I gain more information about where I need to then observe the behavior happening. So that's useful. I can't leave out those indirect methods of assessment. I can't leave out questionnaires. So one of the things that I do is I give the parent a questionnaire. Now I administer it myself. I don't just hand it to them, because I feel like when they're answering these questions, I can dive deep into why they responded that way. Again, gaining more information. So typically what I do with the questionnaire is I use either the FAST, which is the functional assessment screening tool. I can also use the QABF, which is the questions about behavioral function. And I can also look at something that's called the MAS, the Motivational Assessment Scale. So I'm going to look at one of those. I don't have to do all three, but I'm going to pick one based on the child's profile. Okay. Which one makes the most sense now that I understand the kid's profile? All right. Now I'm going to, after I've sort of have a good understanding of what's happening, right? And I've met with maybe the school team and identified what the target behaviors are. That's really important. Once we have identified the target behaviors and we have defined them, a draft, right? An idea of a definition, right?
So ahead of time to discuss what we're looking at, what target behaviors we're looking at, right?
Exactly. I will revise that definition once I have completed the FBA. But to start, we should have the target behaviors and the definition. Okay. Mm-hmm. Once we're done with our indirect methods of assessment, now is where you get into the meat of the functional behavior assessment. You do your direct methods of assessment. That means your eyes and your ears, right? Even sometimes your body, right? Because you may be in that room and I may feel the impact of a kid who's pretty aggressive and I'm saying, okay, that was pretty intense, right? Or, that seems superficial, right? It wasn't that bad. It could take an easy redirection. So that is when I then say, okay, now we have to start to collect some data. The first thing that I start to collect, it's called antecedent behavior consequence data, ABC data. An FBA is not an FBA unless you have ABC data.
Thank you. And how long, Solandy, should we take that data? I see it so often where there's ABC data that's like literally taken over the course of a morning and then they draft the FBA. And it's probably the morning before the IEP meeting. And I say, yeah, I mean, shouldn't we we're talking about human behavior. So shouldn't we look at it over the course of time in order to get a good sense of how it occurs day to day, different times of the day, who's in the classroom, what setting we're in, all of those things?
So you want to have enough data to start to see patterns. If you don't have enough data to pick up and do an ABC data analysis and then start to graph that data and see and identify patterns of behavior, right? When these things are happening, what happens before the behavior, what people are doing about the behavior, how they're responding, then you haven't collected enough data. Okay. I can't tell you it has to be done across a number of hours or across a number of days because every behavior is different. If a behavior happens at very low frequencies, I may be there for weeks. Okay. But if a behavior happens at high rates, I may collect my data in a full day and have enough to say, oh my goodness, this is a serious situation, right? So it all really depends. You need enough of it though to analyze. Okay. The second, there's a couple things that I want to take a look at. I want to collect summative data, right? How often is the behavior happening? Frequency data. How long are the episodes of the behavior? Duration. How intense, right? So I want to measure intensity. How severe are these behaviors? I may also look at latency. And I may also
latency is how long in between behaviors.
Well, that is actually inter-response. So inter-response is like when a behavior stopped and when it started.
Okay.
Latency is when I asked him to write his name, how long did it take him to write his name?
Okay. I knew we weren't doing something. Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting thing to look at too. So almost like response time.
Sure.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So latency, I would say, is equivalent to response time. Okay.
Right. Okay.
So I'm going to take a look at all those and I'm going to graph my data and then analyze it again, right? And compare it to all the other findings that I have, all the other information that I've gathered. There's also something that's called a scatter plot. And let me tell you, if it's okay, a little story about how a scatter plot sort of was really helpful in one of the cases that I had.
Yeah.
So a scatter plot is when you look at the day, okay, and you break it down into, let's say, I don't know, periods, right? So let's say I'm at a school, I'm breaking a scattered plot down into periods, and I leave, but the instructions that I leave for the staff are that they're supposed to highlight if the behavior occurred in that sort of block of time. And when I come back at the end of the week, I take a look at the schedule, and then I start to see if there are pockets, right? Like really, really big sort of areas where the behavior is happening the most often. And the reason why I do this is so that I know that's where I have to go and observe the behavior. Okay. And where it's not happening and data is not being collected, I've got to go there too. Why? Because where it's not happening, something is happening that is not triggering the behavior or preventing the behavior. Either somebody's doing a really good job at delivering intervention, or somebody's just not doing anything. Right.
Yeah. And Solandy, I love that you say that, because so often that's a misunderstood thing about behavior in and of itself, is that we can support a behavior and we can trigger a behavior. So we can support a child so that the behavior doesn't happen. We can use proactive strategies, and a child can be triggered as well. And so we might need some reactive strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And far too often I see schools that say, oh, well, we do positive behavior intervention supports. And so we've got this PBIS and it works for everybody. And it doesn't. And then they say, well, we aren't going to do anything reactive, or vice versa, places where it's only reactive. And particularly if it's attention seeking or tangible item is the function of the behavior, and they are reacting every single time something happens, then we're just feeding into that behavior. So I'm really happy that you said that. That's kind of tangential to what we're talking about right now, but I'm just really happy you said that, because I have to say that in so many meetings that I just think that's really misunderstood sometimes.
Yeah, both are important. When I'm teaching my graduate students and they're doing their first functional behavior assessment and writing their first behavior intervention plans, I usually say to them, the paper better weigh heavy on preventative strategies.
Yes.
And weigh less on reactive strategies, because if you have really good preventative interventions, you never have to react to it. You should have reactive strategies in there. Why? Because you need to know what to do if the behavior happens. Right?
It's going to happen. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to move on to behavior intervention plans, but before that, so there's lots of elements to an FBA, but that ABC data, and then starting with the student's profile and some good data, really is the key to it, right? But I want to ask you one thing first, and that is, in the FBA, I love what you just said, is we need those strategies. So many FBAs that I read don't have that. They never play with the consequence. They never see if they can figure out how to support the behavior. And so can you walk us through, if an FBA is lacking that, how would a parent ask for that? Like, how do we say this FBA doesn't have any information about what we do now? It just goes through the functions after a half a day of observation.
That in my FBAs, it's part of my recommendations. So my recommendations will outline for the team what the behavior intervention plan needs to address and how they need to address it.
Mm-hmm.
The summary, the recommendations, the summary and the recommendations won't necessarily provide you with protocols as to, how to actually implement an intervention, but it'll tell you what intervention needs to be done. I mean, yes, there are times where I'm working with teams and they write up an FBA and there may be a summary, but there aren't any recommendations. I could understand how that's frustrating.
Like, why do you do this?
Yeah, it is. I could see if I was the parent at the table, I can see how that is very frustrating. What I will, I never do, I make sure that there are recommendations. What I will say, however, is that the FBA should be accepted before you develop the behavior support plan. Because if it's not accepted and it's not comprehensive and it's and the team isn't feeling as though it's complete, then you can't really move forward with developing the behavior intervention plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I want to be sensitive to both scenarios, right? I can, yes, I can totally understand how a family may be upset. Like even a teacher, I'd be upset. I'm like, just tell me what to do now, right?
Right. And that's what, but I understand what you're saying. So even if you get one that you think isn't comprehensive, you can take the information from it and try to use that to develop a good behavior support plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So behavior support plan, behavior intervention plans, that would follow then the FBA. That's the document that then would provide the behavioral supports, whether proactive or reactive, to support the child. So can you kind of describe in a nutshell what I call it a BIP, a behavior intervention plan? I like the word support better than intervention actually, because it's more comprehensive. So can you tell us kind of in a nutshell what that document is?
Sure. So we're using behavior intervention plan and behavior support plan very often, sort of like it's the same thing.
Yes.
Okay. A behavior intervention plan has your target behavior or behaviors, right? With the operational definition. So it's very clear what is happening. Okay. It's defined well. So if you and I have never seen the behavior and now we read it and then we see it, we can say, yeah, that's what I pictured based upon reading this definition. So it starts off with that. Then the next thing a behavior intervention plan has that follows each target behavior are the replacement behaviors. So when you identify a target behavior, you better have replacement behaviors to address that problem. Okay. So you have now identified those and defined them a little bit too. The first then section of strategies or interventions are your preventative strategies or interventions, right? How can I prevent this behavior from happening? How can I arrange the environment so that I can avoid triggering this behavior? How can I arrange the environment so that it is so rich with visual supports if necessary, reinforcement if necessary, movement breaks. You know, if I have worked with an OT, an occupational therapist, and she has said to me, you know what, I've noticed that when I engage in this kind of activity and then go and, do some reading, there's more of engagement, right? And I'm going to say, okay, that could be a strategy that we use. She's recommending it. I'm supporting it based on the information that I've gathered, and we're working together, right, to make sure that we develop this behavior support plan that's informed by everyone, right? So that's the section that I keep saying has to be heavy, heavy, heavy. What that also includes is some reinforcement strategies, right? Do we need formal, individualized, specific reinforcement systems in place, right? Token economy systems.
Yeah.
Something that I call deferential reinforcement systems, right? Do I need to be that sort of specific? That's in your preventative section, right? That's where you're going to be including all that information. Do I need to make sure that the child, when they come into school, the first thing that we do is we offer them to finish their breakfast, right? Because maybe we've identified that they can't communicate that they're hungry and, they're just not eating at home. And we found out that, hey, they really need to have their tummy satisfied before we start instruction, right? They're hangry. Okay. Those types of things, you'll be surprised what I find as part of an FBA. The child's not able to communicate to tell you he's hungry, right? Let's make sure mom and I are on board. We didn't realize we now through this functional behavior assessment, we discovered that he's hungry. And that's like one piece of the many things that are probably going wrong.
Right.
So things like that, right? offering an extra snack, doing preference assessments to figure out what the child is motivated by and what they are not motivated by, right? Don't make assumptions. Then we move to the next section, which is now your management, right? If these behaviors happen, what am I supposed to do about it? Because I don't want to continue to reinforce it or maintain it.
Right.
So that section again is specific, but it doesn't have to necessarily be heavy because you want to make sure that you're preventing the behavior from happening, but it's necessary, especially if you're talking about behaviors that are unsafe, right? You want to make sure that we have those things in place for when the behavior happens, so that we can block it, so that we can redirect it, and implement the procedures that we need and the protocols to keep the child safe.
Well, and it just kind of describes the if then, because you've built the framework at the beginning, you've developed the litany of replacement behaviors, and you've developed the litany of preventative measures that you've taken already. And you might be able to flip over, and if you catch it early enough and get back into a preventative cycle. But when you talk about management, you're really talking about, you're just kind of reiterating those and saying, if this happens, then we're going to use this strategy. And if this happens, then we use this strategy that you've already articulated up above, right?
Right.
Yeah. And, that's so many parents will now look at their behavior plans and say, oh my gosh, mine only has this management section, but nothing's described above. There's no replacement behaviors in this FBA or this BIP. There's no any kind of preventative strategies in this document. And I know that's going to happen as my audience is listening, because I read them at least once a week. I read one that is really weak on that stuff. So that is a gold mine of information, Solandy. I know this is what you do every day, but that kind of tick list of what should be in the document is really, really powerful information for people.
Ashley, if I could just jump in really quick, what you don't want to leave out of a behavior support plan is also how you're going to collect data to evaluate if it's working, and how you're going to fade that plan out or discontinue it for the future. So those are two pieces that are important, smaller areas, but important.
I have never seen that, and I love that. So both things. So take data. So even if it's not a goal in the IEP, as part of the BIP, we should be taking data on the target behaviors and how they're occurring, even if it isn't every minute of every day or something like that. And then also a plan to fade the supports.
Yeah. So plan to fade and discontinue the supports, and then you're not just collecting data on the target behaviors, you're collecting data also on the replacement behaviors, because you want to see those improve. You want to see those happening.
Right. So you want to see that graph go up, and you want to see the behavior graph go down.
Exactly.
Oh, see, I knew you were smart. You're so Solandy, thank you so much. This is really, really good information.
Good.
So Solandy, I promise my audience that I will bring you back, because we've got a gold mine of information to talk about when we talk about collaborating with an outside BCBA or behaviorist with your school district, bringing you on as part of the team so that we aren't looking at an FBA as an IEE, an independent educational evaluation. I'm really excited for that conversation too. But before we sign off today, will you tell everybody where they can find you and your company, Milestones Behavioral Health?
Sure. So you can find us, our website's www.mbs-inc.org. We are also on Facebook. So if you look for Milestones Behavioral Services, Inc., you should find us on Facebook. And my email, if you all want to email me directly, I'm totally fine with that, is S as in Sam, F as in Frank, ORTE @mbs-inc.org. I'm happy to chat. I'm here as a resource, even from Connecticut. So if you want to call and you want to chat about FBAs and behavior support plans and some of the other work that we do, um, give us a call.
Oh my
Happy
gosh,
to help.
you're too kind. Thank you so much. This has been such an honor. Thanks, Solandy.
Thank you for having me.